So, what I'm going to talk about today is talk about drought, and drought in the context of agriculture and drought in the context of climate change, because what we're facing here across the greater American West is an aridifying climate, right? And aridification basically just means that the combination of evaporative demand, how thirsty the atmosphere is increasing relative to the amount of precipitation that falls, right? And those things in combination end up influencing everything from the distribution of vegetation, the viability of growing certain crops, the viability of water resources. And if we think about that, all those things end up actually factoring into our culture. And so I may be biased, but as a climatologist, I firmly believe that climate is one element that sort of defines our culture, right? And one thing that I think we generally can agree on is we don't want our culture to change that much. And so, so climate change seems pretty important from that perspective. So I'll be sort of framing this through the lens of agriculture. And I'm going to have a few prompts in here. So you can enter this into the chat box and we'll go back and look at it later on. But effectively, I want you to maybe provide one or two sort of what are some of the implications of climate change for agriculture? Is it good? Is it bad? Right? If it's good, give me an example, right? So, you know, I have 6-year-old twins. They don't like Brussels sprouts. So they'd say it's good because it's going to provide unsuitable growing conditions for Brussels sprouts. Okay, that's a facetious example, but think about an example or two, and we'll look at them here in a bit. So if we're thinking about sort of agriculture, right, we need to realize that water plays a key source in growing a number of crops, right? You have to have the right amount of water at the right time of the year. That water comes in the form of precipitation. And this equation here, I'm not going to show you more equations, but this is one of them. And it's basically saying that precipitation has a few fates, right? One is it's used for evapotranspiration, water loss from the soil, water loss through plants, right? And so when crops are growing, when agriculture is growing, evapotranspiration is the process through which crops are basically using water. And that actually helps them grow. Right, water can also go to stream flow. That's what we observe in our rivers, in our streams, that water flows to our reservoirs, okay? Precipitation can also fall in the form of snow and be stored away in mountain snowpack, which is a hugely important resource for the broader West. Okay, the number, I think about 75% of the runoff across the broader Western United States originates and falls as snow. So that snow is a hugely important resource for us. And then of course, water can also be stored below ground in soil moisture. And so thinking about some of the ways that we can adapt to a changing climate may actually have us looking below the ground rather than above the ground. Okay, so we know that, of course, climate is highly variable spatially. This is showing us here a map of annual precipitation across the broader Northwest. And we know that there's a disparity between where precipitation falls and where that water is used for agriculture, whether it's Idaho or whether it's Washington State, right? So we rely on these large water conveyance networks, right? Streams, reservoirs, storage systems, groundwater, et cetera, to make up for the disparity, because across most of the Western United States, the bulk of the precipitation falls in winter and spring, and the bulk of water that's used for agriculture is in summer. So there's a mismatch there, right? And so the way that that's made up for is, of course, snowpack and then storage and groundwater. Okay. I didn't put this prompt into the sort of chat box. And if I ask the question, what is drought? I'm sure I'd get a variety of answers, none of them being wrong, none of them being right. There's a lot of ways to define drought. And so this is a definition that I like. This is a former postdoc advisor of mine, Kelly Redmond, basically defines it as insufficient water to meet the needs. So whether you are a fish, you have needs, whether you are a farmer, you have needs. It's all about timing, right? It's all about whether that supply and demand match. Okay. Now, regardless of what definition we want to use for drought, we had it bad this year, right? Not just in Idaho, the entire Western United States. I think we looked across the broader West this year, that's about as bad widespread drought as we've seen in the instrumental record, at least for individual years. We've had longer term droughts, including in Idaho, but certainly no shortage of drought this year. Part of the story of drought is precipitation, right? Drought years usually low precipitation. The other side, of course, is that the atmosphere is asking for more water back, right? And this is showing us a map of the trends over the last 40 years, the trends in the evaporative demand, right? How much water is effectively potentially lost from the surface to the atmosphere. So think about this as basically how much extra water you might need to keep your grass green if you have grass and it was well watered. And the story here is that when it's warmer, drier, windier, sunnier, demand is higher. And what we've seen over time is a fairly large increase in the demand. And that's making it that much easier to get a drought. And when droughts happen, that makes them that much more severe. So it's not just precipitation. We now have a warming climate that's imposing an additional tax on our water resources. Okay, and there's sort of a time series of that showing, I think that's 2020. I don't have 2021 yet, but you can think where 2021 might be on this time series. It's going to be up there with some of those 2012 or 2020, I think. I'll tell you the story of the ongoing sequence of droughts in California. I think California has certainly seen the worst of the droughts in the West in the past decade. However, Idaho may be next, right? Droughts are a combination of natural variability, a lack of precipitation, and now, of course, we have a warmer and drier atmosphere that's effectively making droughts that much more intense. So this is a picture of sort of, what the drought looked like in California went through in 2012 to 2016. Not only was it the worst sort of multi-year drought in the instrumental record, but part of what we also do is we actually look at tree rings that can tell us about the climate well before we were, emptying out rain gauges and looking at thermometers. And by actually tracing tree rings back through time, we find that this drought was actually the worst in 1,200 years. So as a consequence of the droughts in California, of course, really degraded reservoir storage, significant impacts to California's agriculture, something like $10 billion or so. And then, of course, we saw something like 130 million trees die in the Sierra Nevada that have instigated some of the significant fires that we've seen in recent years. Okay. And so this was all when I was in Idaho, right? I'm like, okay, California's having it bad, et cetera. And then I moved to California in early 2020. And the last 2 years have been brutal. So similar sorts of pictures. Reservoirs completely parched. One of the large reservoir in California, Oroville Dam, which you might have heard of a couple of years ago, almost topping over because of flooding, reached its lowest point in the period of record, so low that they were unable to generate hydropower. Right, so this becomes a water and energy issue. The fires the last 2 years in California have been just heads and tails above any other sort of year. Approximately 6 to 7% of the state has burned in the last 2 years. We have seen fire basically touch every part of the state. And of course, y'all are smelling the smoke from California fires. So what burns in California doesn't necessarily stay in California. So it gets even worse. And I mean, this is gloom and doom, right? So I'm going to tell you about the gloom and doom, and then we're going to talk about some solutions at the end. So we've had some bad drought years, individual years. The reality, though, is if we look at the last 20 years or so, primarily southwestern United States. So this is actually this would include the southern extent of Idaho all the way down to the Mexican border. We find that we are in a long-term drought. So not just 1 year, not just 2 or 3 years, but 20 years. And we call this a mega drought, right? Prolonged period of really, really parched soils, low soil moisture, low runoff in the summer months. This is what's resulting in, the Colorado River system being taxed and Lake Mead being incredibly low. And we again sort of look at how this has tracked over the instrumental record, which is in blue there. And then we bring this back using tree rings as well. And what we find is that this current drought in the Southwest is essentially the worst in 1,200 years, and it says second worst. But if we go in and we add the last 3 years, which have not been too kind to drought, it ends up being the worst that we've seen. One of the stories behind this drought is that it would have been a mega drought, even in the absence of human-caused climate change. But again, human-caused climate change is taxing the system. More precipitations falling as rain, less as snow, right? And then of course we have a warmer atmosphere, which is pulling more moisture out of our soil. So the gist of this study actually showed that about half of the magnitude of this current drought could be attributed to climate change. So climate change taking sort of a good mega drought and making it the worst one in 1,200 years at least. Okay, so let me show you a little bit for Idaho. These are probably some figures or numbers you're sort of aware of, but Idaho, of course, has seen similar warming. Warming is quite similar to what we see for the broader Western United States. This data goes up through 2020. This is calendar year temperature. And you can see that there's no other sort of 10 or 20 year period like what we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years, right? There is an individual year here, which was during the Dust Bowl, right? And during that Dust Bowl, Idaho had really, really low precipitation for a long time. And so this is the next picture of precipitation, right? Here's that Dust Bowl drought long-term, right? This is sort of Idaho's mega drought, right? If you really want to think about it like that, except this of course occurred during a period where temperatures were, not consistently as warm as they are today. And of course, water use is not what it was today. So there are some concerns. And I know I was working with some folks in Idaho on looking at what if a mega drought happened today and impacted the Magic Valley and a lot of the irrigation demands in the Snake River Plain. And the story doesn't look great there. If a mega drought kind of like this, but a warmer one consistent with a warming climate occurred then. So let's talk a little bit about the future, and this may be information that most people on this call are sort of privy to, but climate change is happening. It's associated with increases in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, et cetera. Those are effectively also imposing additional tax, right? That's extra energy that's trapped in the Earth atmosphere system. And that energy is approximately about 2 watts per meter square. So here's my 100-watt light bulb, if you can still find them. Here's a 20 by 20 foot patch of land, right? So that's essentially one of these spread across the planet, right? And this is all about energy. And the future, we're in sort of, we don't know how the future is going to sort of look, right? We don't know how many more light bulbs we're going to have. About 10 years ago, right, what we were thinking is that without any additional climate policy, we would have 4 of these 100-watt light bulbs, right, which is representative of sort of a high-end warming scenario. The goal of climate mitigation is to get this down to as few light bulbs as possible. Realistically, it's probably going to be 2 or 3, right? So 2 light bulbs would be, I don't know if folks are familiar with sort of the scenarios, but that would be equivalent to a little bit more than about a 2 degrees Celsius warming of global temperatures. Okay, so that's sort of the future with uncertainty obviously built into it. And then one more figure, and then we'll go to talking about some of the agricultural impacts and adaptations. So this is a figure from the most recent IPCC Intergovernmental Climate Change Assessment Report. Subsequent reports are coming out, I think, next year and the year after. But I think that this figure is quite effective at sort of showing where we are today, where we're going to go, and what our options are from a mitigation perspective. And so the story here is that instead of showing you time on the x-axis, this is actually the amount of cumulative carbon dioxide emissions since the Industrial Revolution, right? So as you read, and then we have temperature, perturbations of temperature from essentially the same thing, right? Pre-industrial temperature. So what you can see here is that historically this is sort of tracked along this sort of similar trajectory. And then the various colors here are climate models that are run out into the future. And you can kind of see they all track pretty similar to one another. So the story here is that, you know, it doesn't really, I mean, we can think about all these different climate scenarios, there's uncertainty, et cetera. But what's pretty clear is that we can sort of break this down into figuring out the amount of warming that we're going to see globally is a function of how much emissions are going to occur. So we're here today, and the question is, how far down this path are we going to go? And this is all a function of time and obviously policy ramifications, but the goal is to stay somewhere less than 2, right? That's a hypothetical goal. Okay, I want to show you 2 projections for the Northwest, and then I think I have agricultural stuff after that. So this is some Northwest, these are some Northwest projections that, that a number of colleagues and I put together, right? And it turns out that the amount of warming globally is less than what we expect to see in the Northwest, right? And so because land warms faster than oceans globally, right, 2 degrees Celsius warming globally translates roughly to about at least 3 degrees Celsius over land. And so we see sort of similar results for here, the Northwest. And so there's sort of, you know, a future where we reduce our emissions, you know, not quite at the, not quite keeping it less than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, but sort of along the same track. And then there's sort of a high emissions scenario that I don't think we're going to follow, but who knows? The reality is that warming is sort of baked in regardless of which path we follow. The amount of warming is a function of, you know, where we end up. But for the next, say, 30 to 40 years, not a huge difference between scenarios. Okay, precipitation's a mixed bag, not a huge change overall, maybe a slight increase. That increase, though, is swamped because we have so much year-to-year variability, right? If you said that precipitation is going to increase 5%, and can you notice it? It might be hard to notice because you see wild year-to-year swings in how much precipitation falls, but maybe a bit more. And I should mention that the increase in precipitation likely would be winter and spring, with a sort of a little bit of a decrease in the summer months. Okay, I lied. I'm going to show you a map before we talk about the agriculture, because I think we're working towards how this may relate to agriculture. So these are also some projections that might relate a bit more to agricultural impacts, right? Maybe agricultural impacts, maybe some other things. So first is showing us, and this is just the Northwest, right? The top panels there show the freeze season length, so number of days between your last spring freeze and your first fall freeze, right? That freeze season may be important in identifying whether certain crops might be productive or not, right? Certain crops we do know need a long season. When I was in Moscow, I harvested lots of green tomatoes, right? So I'm sure that happens. And so maybe in this case, a longer growing season might allow me to get more red tomatoes. Okay, so that's me saying that it's going to be good. Climate change is good for agriculture for the one tomato or the tomato grower in Moscow, Idaho. The problem with that, of course, is that a longer freeze season might also be good for weeds and pests, right? So there's multiple sides to that coin. The number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, if you like temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, then there's good news for you. Certain, high temperatures at certain growth stages in crops can be very detrimental. So again, my tomato grower example is that when there are very warm temperatures, close to when tomatoes are setting their flowers, you will get very low pollination rates. And so you get a lot of flowers and very little fruit from that. And so timing ends up being pretty important as well. Oh, I didn't bring in the right slide. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at the chat here and see what kind of things we said. And you can kind of see what I put up here. So the question is whether we have any match at all. So we do have less water available for crops, and that's certainly an issue, both for dryland crops as well as irrigation. That's going to be a hugely important issue, especially because I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but irrigated crops in Idaho are by far the most profitable. Oh, great. Yeah. So bloom times, I see one in here. Bloom times may not align with pollinator emergence. So that's a mismatch in the phenology. That can absolutely happen. You also can shift the timing of when certain fruits mature. One thing that at least we've been looking at in Washington state is that because it's warmer earlier, the cherries start maturing earlier. The issues for cherries is if you end up maturing earlier in the year in Washington state, those matured cherries may run into rain, and rain on cherries is not good. You crack the cherries and they're not marketable. I also see, changes in the types of wine grapes grown, right? And so that may be good or bad. It is an adaptation. That's great. I will actually talk about something similar to that here later on. More high heat index days that affect the growing season, livelihood of farmers. That is also quite true. One thing that I've absolutely been thinking about quite a bit is the not necessarily the agriculture side, but the labor side, right? And we do know we have people who are harvesting crops, working in the fields during oppressive heat waves, during smoke events. And so there's obviously challenges there. And also, did I see this in here? Yeah, longer growing seasons. Okay, water availability shifts. Yes. So I think that a lot of the elements, and thanks for everybody for putting those in the chat. I think a lot of those are sort of baked into this slide here. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about sort of what climate change means for water resources, because water resources are going to be critically important for a lot of, you need water to grow crops, right? And so one of the arguments that is frequently sort of touted is that climate change is good for agriculture because CO2 is plant food, right? So more CO2 is going to increase plant productivity, et cetera. And it turns out that that's perfectly fine and dandy if the crops are growing with all other conditions being optimal. But if the crops are growing, you can have as much CO2 and nitrogen, et cetera. If they don't have water, they don't have water, right? That's a limiting reagent for growth. So climate change influences drought through two mechanisms: one, reducing the snowpack, and also sucking more from a half-empty drink, right, with increasing evaporative demand. So we've seen some pretty good evidence of climate change. I think one of the hallmark indicators of climate change across the American West, particularly if you're near a mountain range, is the decline in mountain snowpack, very well documented through time. We've also seen more of that runoff happening in the spring and in the winter and less in the summer. And so that's increasing increasing the distance between when water is flowing and when water is being used or requested, at least from an irrigation perspective. We have reservoirs and dams, and we have some technological ways of sort of trying to solve that, and that works up to a point until we then realize that fish need water too, and other aquatic systems need water as well. We've done some work looking globally, and then we'll bring this back down to Idaho. Globally, we expect that a lot of agricultural systems globally are also dependent on snowmelt, like we see in Idaho, like we see across the American West. We expect that under future climate change, that the snowpack will dissipate, and more of that runoff will happen as rain rather than snow. And what that does, and this is an example here for Idaho, this is a hydrograph, if you will, a really smooth hydrograph. So on the x-axis, this is the month of the year, and then on the y-axis, this is the flow. And this is just an example of the St. Joe River in northern Idaho, but it looks fairly similar for a lot of the other river systems in Idaho. So the historical data from a snowmelt-driven system is that the flow is happening, May, June, July. With warming, of course, more runoff in the winter and spring, and then significantly less in the summer. So that's a very well-known sort of story. And the question is, are we going to be able to cope with that? And so this is a question that I'll ask you all. What do we think holds more water? Is it A, the average April 1st snow across Idaho, or is it the entirety of Idaho's reservoir storage? And you can shout it out, type it into the chat box. So A would be the snow, and B are the reservoirs. It's the snow. This is not a good question. This is too easy, huh? I have to ask how much more, right? That's probably a better question. Anybody have any idea about how much more? How much more? Is it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 10 times? It's a good question. Yeah, I had to calculate it myself. So that's why I think it's a good question as well. So it's 3 times, right? So we actually calculate the total snowpack just within the confines of Idaho. It's 3 times the total current reservoir storage capacity of the state. And so, of course, we have these systems that allow us to sort of, that snow will be held on there, it'll melt out, it does so, and it synchronizes very well with water resources and our infrastructure, such that we can rely a lot on at least surface water for irrigation. We still pull from groundwater, and I don't know how much, I don't know off the top of my head. I think probably David Hokema or others probably gave you some information about how much groundwater is extracted. We do know that more groundwater is extracted during droughts. So an example from California is that during normal years, whatever the heck a normal year is in California, this doesn't exist. During normal years, about 40% of the irrigation in the San Joaquin Valley is pulled from groundwater. During drought years, that number can go to 80%. And we've seen groundwater extraction actually reach a breaking point in California, where they've implemented a policy that is now restricting groundwater pumping, such that by 2040, there should be a steady state, a balance between how much water is being put into groundwater versus how much water is being taken out. And because that is detrimentally impacting communities, especially folks that do not have access to deep wells. There's some serious environmental justice issues that have been going on. So that's Idaho in a 20th century context. And Idaho by the mid 21st century, if we look at some of the projections of snowpack, we see that this number is now reduced. All right, so now it's twice as much, right? And so the challenge, of course, is, how are we going to get that water, right? If assuming no change in reservoir operations, etc. Right? What you'd envision is that if we no longer have as much water stored away in snowpack, we only can store so much in reservoirs, the story will be that we're going to rely more on groundwater extraction, right, in the future. And that may sound bad, but that also may be a solution to some degree. The caveat is that we need to encourage ways to actually recharge groundwater, if that's the case. And so I'll mention a little bit of that here about how that's being done, at least in California. So I've talked about evaporative demand, right? This is basically the straw. The atmosphere is sort of the straw sucking harder as things are getting warmer. And that is taxing sort of the overall water budget. Certainly increases crop water demand. In natural systems, it also allows those systems to dry out faster, be more available to burn, which of course has lots of other impacts. So I wanted to talk about a couple adaptation practices or technologies. I will say that I'm not an expert in the details of these, other than I can provide some high-level notes. Right. And it might have been actually in some of the chat box items that were brought up. So one of the solutions, right, at least in terms of adaptation, agricultural adaptations to climate change, is to follow the heat and follow the water, right? So we have traditional planting dates, we have traditional crops. So we know that we're going to see warming, and that warming may provide opportunities. So crops could be planted and also mature earlier in the year. Right. And at least some of the work that I was involved with in sort of more eastern Washington, northern Idaho, looking at wheat there, is that though the wheat crop, at least the dryland wheat crop, would actually do quite okay under climate change, because it's able to sort of capture wet winters that we expect that we'll still have. We also see the crops maturing earlier in the year because it's warmer. Other options include thinking about what crops we grow. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I know one of the most sort of widespread crops in Idaho is alfalfa. Alfalfa is a very water intensive crop. You can have multiple cuttings. To some degree, if it's warmer with climate change, you may allow yourself more cuttings, but it's a very water intensive crop. And the more cuttings, the more water. So there's going to be some interesting decisions on sort of thinking about sort of how valuable water is from a sort of a growing perspective. At the same time, we know that Idaho has seen a significant increase in dairy, right? And of course, with dairy comes a lot of additional crops like alfalfa, corn, et cetera, they're pretty water intensive. Also, we'll say that California has seen a dramatic decline in alfalfa and is now relying more on imports from other locations, including Idaho. So a lot of the decisions here when it comes to adaptation also to some degree will involve economics, which is a challenging topic to sort of balance, right? The second item there, it might be unpopular, but certainly a lot of genetically modified crops have been developed. Most of them have been developed for economic reasons, right? Increases in yield, maybe flavor, mainly yield. I know that there are some folks that are working on basically using GMO to build climate resilient crops. So focusing on ways that crops can sort of tolerate heat, tolerate water limitations. So there's certainly some sort of technology there. I'd say that's really technology. Technology has gotten us a long way in terms of increasing yields, et cetera. There's obviously costs associated with that, though. I wanted to also think about a potential adaptation to climate change, with the idea being that we may see complete full-scale shifts in what can be grown. And I think that was one of the things in the chat box regarding the growing of wine grapes, right? And so this is just an example here showing us average July temperatures in Boise. Historically, at least, over much of the latter half of the 21st century, the average, I think, was around 91 degrees Fahrenheit. I think 2021 was the warmest July on record, though, so getting up to like 98. And certainly, the sort of the constellation of agriculture that exists in the Treasure Valley is partially defined by climate, what can be grown. There's probably some cultural reasons as well. The question, right, and we're thinking about sort of, using climate change, but instead of sort of showing the numbers, we're going to actually take you to that place. So where can you find today? So we're expecting by 2070, under some climate change scenarios, that the average high temperature in Boise in July will be 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a bit toasty. The question is, where would you go today to find average high temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit? Where would you go? What are some areas? And type these into the chat near the equator. The equator is not on my map, so Phoenix, Southern California, Utah, Death Valley. Death Valley wishes that they were 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I think you got the general idea. So here's a few locations, right? So it ends up being places like northern Las Vegas, sort of the northern and southern edges of the Central Valley of California. Very, very different places, right? Very, very different. If you were to go and look at the collection of crops, et cetera, that exist in those locations, they look very different than what they do in the Treasure Valley today. We've actually, former PhD student of mine at the University of Idaho looked at how climate change might influence these crop hardiness zones that many people might be familiar with. If you go to the nursery, garden center, you're planting any perennial that survives over winter. You might want to be careful with what you plant. The fun story is that when I was living in Moscow, my mom and dad sent me a lemon tree because I'm Greek, and apparently you need to have a lemon tree if you're Greek. And they sent me a lemon tree, and I'm a climatologist. I'm just like, are you kidding me? What are we doing here? So anyways, the story is the lemon tree was inside for the winter, and then I got tired of it dropping its leaves, and it went outside and it died because it wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't cold hardy to withstand northern Idaho winters. But what we expect with climate change is that these zones will shift. They will move northward and upwards. And it turns out that the coldest day in the winter warms about 40% more than your average winter days. The idea is that the cold air masses that originate in the Arctic are warming disproportionately more than our average air masses. So we've done some additional work looking at how climate change may influence the suitability of certain types of crops. And we did some work for the Northwest, oh, I'm missing the acronym. Anyways, the Northwest sort of climate and agriculture group. And we focused on a set of specialty crops that included cherries and apples. We also threw in almonds because almonds are an incredibly lucrative economic crop in California. They have expanded dramatically over the past 20 years. And they also use an absolute ton of water that create a huge burden on the California water issue. And one of the questions we had was whether almonds might be viable in other areas that have water to alleviate the burden in California. So this is at least just showing cherries, and the green is showing us current locations where cherries are grown, including a little bit in the Treasure Valley. But a lot of it's in Washington State, a little bit in California. And then in blue there, those are areas that we mapped that would be climatically suitable for cherries. Right, it's cold enough, but not too cold. It's warm enough for the cherry to mature, those sorts of things. And then we start looking at sort of how climate change may actually change that suitability. And what you see, at least here, and this is for 2010 to 2030, and then 2040 to 2069, is that at least you do see a pretty substantial expansion of years where it's suitable for cherry growing in parts of the Snake River Plain, right? And so that may provide opportunity, right? Especially to capitalize on areas that may become unsuitable. Anything in blue here becomes unsuitable, right? It's actually not cold enough for the fruit to set in parts of southern San Joaquin Valley under the future. And so there's obviously a lot of cherries grown there today. Can they be grown somewhere else? That, of course, isn't alleviating our water problem, right? But it obviously would be a switch. You'd have to switch out a water-intensive crop for a non-water intensive crop that might have greater economic value, especially if it can no longer be grown in other areas as regularly. And interestingly enough, there has also been some thoughts on whether almonds could be grown in California. Almonds could be grown in Idaho that are obviously currently grown mainly all in California. There's some work that's being done, I think, in Parma with some test trials, and it seems to be working generally. There obviously are some cold winters that the almonds are dealing with. Some of the projections, at least, that we have suggest that some of the warmer, like the banana belts of the Treasure Valley, may become more suitable by mid-century. It's not something to root for, I would say, but it obviously is an interesting thing to think about in terms of how one deals with climate change. Almonds in the Treasure Valley would obviously increase water use. You'd have to switch out other really very water intensive crops. Other approaches for adapting include thinking about sort of the water infrastructure, right? And so obviously there are things like improving water use efficiency. There's still a lot of sort of central pivot irrigation systems in Idaho that could be changed. That reaches a point where you no longer can conserve. You have to actually either figure out ways to be more innovative with water, sharing water, right? Or retire agricultural land, which is also, that can happen. The water infrastructure concept here basically thinks about whether or not we can share water across districts, across boundaries, across states. And a lot of things actually limit the ability to do this today. And so this is somewhat similar to sort of, carbon credits, if you will. And so the idea here is that if you have, say, 2 farms and one farm actually uses too much water, they can buy water from another farm that is not using as much water. So this essentially ends up placing a dollar value on water, creates a water market. And that may incentivize people to use less, right, if they see there's some value for that. So there's some of these applications are sort of beginning in, at least I know Washington State, I know California is thinking about it. I think things are a long way off from implementing this. And I think you've also heard about some of the long-term challenges with water rights that might, make this sticky. Another application is to try to encourage groundwater recharge, right? And so, we know that there's going to be less water in our mountains because snowpack is going to decline with continued warming. Options are to increase reservoir storage, right? Build new reservoirs, all sorts of things like that. There's some crazy ideas about importing water from other locations, probably not going to happen. Another idea is to basically encourage these aquifer recharge scenarios. So this is a picture here of some of the things that are going on in California. They basically mapped out the soil profiles in the state to identify areas where if you flood fields in the winter, periods when you have excess water, if you flood those fields, they'll actually get into the aquifer and recharge the aquifer. A lot of farmers are reluctant to do this because if you were a farmer, would this looks good? I don't know. I mean, are you going to damage your trees or not? Turns out that there's probably actually not damage to trees. There's concerns if you actually leach, certain chemicals into the soil. So if you do too much of this, you can actually leach chemicals into the soil. But what is happening now is that during winter, and this is obviously not winter, during winter and spring, when there's an abundance of precipitation, what's happening is that there's flooding of fields in certain areas. Those farmers are actually being paid to flood their fields, right? And so they're benefiting from it. They're also recharging the groundwaters and aquifers there. And so some techniques like this may be a way of putting a Band-Aid on this bigger issue of declining water availability for these agricultural systems. And the last adaptation solution that I will mention today is looking again below the ground, right? And this is not necessarily about increasing aquifer recharge. It's actually about increasing water holding capacity. And so I don't think I appreciated soils very much until I started, trying to grow trees, and I think in Moscow, and was growing trees on just terrible soil, and realized that, soil water holding capacity really matters. So there are ways in which you can increase the amount of water holding capacity in your soils. It's like a little reservoir system, right? Such that those soils can hold on to more precipitation. They can buffer some of the increases in evaporative demand. And the idea here is that increasing organic matter, right, increasing your soil water holding capacity can actually allow you to produce more with the same amount of water. So that is another technique. I will just end here by mentioning that there are a lot of barriers to adaptation. And this is a nice set of barriers or excuses that I'm sort of borrowing from a colleague. It applies to all elements of climate change, but you can obviously see how these sorts of questions come up quite a bit. My hope is that as we begin to continually see climate change, creep up year after year, we end up realizing that these barriers or excuses are not going to hold weight for too much longer. So with that, I will end, and I'm happy to answer any questions on the topics I covered here, climate in general, anything that folks would like to talk about.
and feel free to use the hand raising, or if you want to turn your video on, if you have some questions, type them in the chat. So I have a question starting us off with. You had us look at the map to see where future Boise would be climate-wise. I'm curious, what will the hotter areas that you talked like look like in the future? Will they just not be able to grow crops?
Hotter areas, like in Idaho or somewhere else?
Like the California, the Utahs, those areas that we were pointing out, like, oh, those are the really hot spots that Idaho is going to be like. So then what happens to those places?
Yeah, I'm gonna show folks this interesting tool, and I'm gonna add it into the chat box. We recently put out a paper, which is not really exciting for most people. It's not that exciting paper. The cool part, I think, is this site here, and I'm gonna go and share my screen because this might get to your questions. So this Jenny might answer your question. At least it's basically doing that little exercise we did before, like where's the climate from Boise coming from, except it'll work for anywhere globally. So and that example I showed you for Boise was just for what happened. The example I showed you for Boise was just for temperature, right? This one's looking at a whole set of variables, so it's much more involved. But the idea here is, we can go and we can click on Boise. Can people see my screen? Yeah, okay. You can click on Boise, and then you can say, okay, find my climate analog. And I actually don't know. Okay, so when the world is 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, right, it's saying that the best climate analog is coming from somewhere here near Mountain Home, a little bit warmer, right? And if I go 4 degrees Celsius, any guesses? People don't want to guess. Let's just click it. I have no idea. It's the same place. It's not going. So that one doesn't go to. It goes a little bit further, right? Probably a little bit further. That one's not as dramatic. But I think your question here, if we do the same thing, right, for some of the warmer locations, for example, Bakersfield, 4 degrees Celsius. Right now we're going to Sonora, Mexico. So very, very different. What's kind of fun about this is you can go down and look at, current landscape, future landscape. And then I think my favorite is the side-by-side Google person. So here's Bakersfield, and then that's not the best example of Bakersfield. You can do the side-by-side like this, right, to get an idea of like, here's what actually it looks like. Now this is irrigated and whatnot, but I think it's an interesting way of thinking about that problem. And if I really wanted to, I'd probably go and click on agricultural region and agricultural region, realizing that lots of other things are going on there.
That's a great tool. I also see that Catherine on the same page of tools is interested in having the slides shared to look over that information later.
Sure, I will send that to, yes, I'll send that to Jenny.
All right. Well, last chance to ask questions. You can put them in the chat, and otherwise, let's give a round of applause to our presenter. Thank you for sharing your information with us today. And just a little bit on our upcoming information. Our next series is going to be November 18th. And we're going to be meeting with Stephanie Krantz. She is the climate change coordinator for the Nez Perce tribe. And she's going to be talking about some old ways of water management, as well as some new ideas going forward. And then Sarah Ray will cap off our presenter. She's the author of A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, How to Keep Your Cool on a Warming Planet. So Brian, better see you there. And if you are not registered for any of those, I'll make sure that the link heads your way. And our final note is that it helps us out quite a bit if you fill out a survey. That helps us make sure that this information is relevant to you. So I will pop that in the chat here in just a moment, or let's see. And I'll send that out in an email as well with the slides and the recording that you can pass on to anyone who might have missed it. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you.
And here, Jenny, I have the links too. I can post them.
Okay. They're floating around in the chat. Perfect. I love that climate adaptation tool, John. That's a great thing that I feel like a lot of us could use with students to zoom around.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Sometimes it gives some interesting results, but I think it's eye-opening, and it forces people to think about. I think part of our reason for developing it was to let people think about climate change in a different way. Rather than give them numbers, show them what it looks like. Sometimes it looks better than
I know.
We had one of my colleagues put an op-ed in the LA Times, and turns out that for Los Angeles, the climate analog is down at the tip of Baja, and so it's people like, oh, that's a better place, like bring it on. Like
Cabo, man.
just Cabo, that's what it was. Yeah, like okay.
Baja in the summer is not pleasant.
That's right. Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. And yeah, it sounds like if I could pass your slides on to some of the educators, it sounds like that would be a great tool for them.
Yeah, I'll send that along to you.
Yeah.
Fabulous.
Thanks, John. I appreciate your time. So thank you for doing
Thanks.
this, helping us out.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
For sure.
Thanks for coming, Genevieve.
Yeah, thank
Really
you.
enjoyed it. I
And
really
Danny.
loved how he asked questions and really incorporated that in. Like it wasn't just a gesture, but it was really part of his presentation.
Yeah.
Your background screen is very fitting for the aridification of the West. So
Yeah, this is Chile, but yeah, but as much like the moon as anywhere else I've been.
yeah.
Or Mars, I guess.
Great. Well, I think it went really well, and I'm excited for the next one. So Jenny, maybe on Wednesday or tomorrow we can go over some of the stuff and chat about it. And yeah, it went great. So
Cool.
You're doing terrific work.
All right. Thanks. Bye,
thanks,
guys.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.